You never think the person next door could ruin your life until they try. And when that person happens to be the president of your HOA, with a God complex and a twisted obsession with control, things can spiral faster than you ever imagined. My name is Marcus Patel. I bought my home in Ridgeview Lakes 2 years ago. Cozy little neighborhood tucked just outside of Dallas. I moved in with my fiancée, Lena, and our dog, Bucky. We thought we were settling into a peaceful, tight-knit community. The kind of place where neighbors wave, mow their lawns on Saturdays, and share holiday cookies. What we didn't know was that behind every smiling face was the watchful eye of Judith Campbell, a woman who treated our HOA like her personal kingdom. Tall, silver-haired, always dressed like she was heading to a courtroom even on a Tuesday afternoon, Judith didn't just enforce the rules, she created them. And when she didn't like you, those rules magically became stricter. Our trouble started with something small, a garden hose. I left it uncoiled on the side of the house one afternoon while washing Bucky. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped to my door. Hose must be stored out of sight. $50 fine. I thought it was ridiculous, but I paid it. How they get you. They start small, so you won't fight. Then came the grass. Too tall. Then the color of our shutters, not HOA-approved beige. Lena got a violation for having wind chimes on the back porch that created a noise disturbance. Even though our nearest neighbor was a retired man who hadn't heard a thing in 20 years at first. I thought maybe we were overreacting. Maybe this was normal HOA stuff. But as well as other neighbors started whispering too. Frank and Helen down the street got fined $200 because their Halloween decorations were offensive. A teenager named Jordan was threatened with suspension of his family's voting rights for excessive street basketball. Then came the incident with the delivery guy. Lena and I had security cameras installed after someone broke into a neighbor's car a few blocks away. One morning, I caught Judith on our footage, marching up to our front porch, moving a small Amazon package and placing it behind our bush near the door. Then she took a photo of it, and a week later I received a fine for unattended deliveries creating visual clutter. That was the final straw. I didn't pay it. I wrote a formal appeal. I requested to meet the HOA board. No response. Then, one night, Lena and I returned from dinner to find a folded paper shoved into our mailbox. It wasn't an envelope or official. Notice, it was handwritten. You're being watched. Keep pushing, and the police will be involved. We stared at each other in disbelief. I reported it to the non-emergency line, but the officer shrugged it off. Could be a prank, he said. Keep an eye on things. I did more than that. I installed 2 more cameras, one facing the street, one covering our porch. Then I went back and reviewed the footage from the last 2 weeks. What I found chilled me. Judith had been coming to our property nearly every other night, sometimes just walking by slowly, sometimes taking photos, sometimes scribbling notes. She even peeked through our living room window once, her reflection captured clearly in the glass. I gathered all the footage. I made copies. I told Lena we had to be careful. But before I could do anything with the evidence, Judith made her move. It was a Saturday morning when it happened. I was in the garage fixing a broken shelf when 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, lights flashing.
Ow.
Bucky barked like crazy. Lena came out of the house with wide eyes, holding her phone like a shield. The officer stepped out and asked for me by name. I approached calmly. Is something wrong, officer? He looked at his tablet, then back at me. We received a call. From a resident, Ms. Judith Campbell. She says you've been harassing her, trespassing, threatening behavior. She claims she saw you tampering with her mailbox and setting up unauthorized surveillance. What? I nearly laughed. She's been stalking us for weeks. I have the footage. She's the one trespassing. At that moment, Judith walked dramatically into the scene, wearing a silk robe, messy bun, and holding a mug that said Queen of the Court. She pointed at me like I was a criminal. That's him. He's been sneaking around my property. I'm afraid for my safety. Officers, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She had flipped the entire situation on its head. The cops started asking more questions, mostly neutral, but I could see they were taking her seriously. She was older, looked shaken, and had clearly rehearsed her story. Thankfully, I stayed calm. "Officer, I have camera footage of her coming to my house, peeking through our window, moving packages. I've never stepped foot on her property. Please come inside. I'll show you everything." To their credit, they agreed. I brought them in and played the footage, one clip after another, Judith snaking around our porch, aiming her phone at our door, even muttering to herself while standing on our walkway at 1:47 a.m. The lead officer leaned back and let out a sigh. "That's concerning." Judith was still standing outside when the officer returned. Her expression changed when they didn't cuff me. In fact, they spoke to her for a good 15 minutes on the lawn arms. Crossed, head shaking. Eventually, they left. No arrests. No charges. But Judith looked like she had swallowed a lemon. What she didn't know is I wasn't done yet. That night, I uploaded the full video compilation to a private link, titled it, "When the HOA President Becomes a Predator." I sent it to every single resident in Ridgeview Lakes along with a letter outlining my experience, fake violations, the police visit, and a link to the HOA bylaws proving she had overstepped her power. The neighborhood exploded. The next morning, group chat had over 400 unread messages. People were furious, sharing their own stories, screenshots, even pictures of Judith snooping around their homes. Some had been too afraid to say anything. Others had just assumed it was normal HOA stuff. But now they knew the truth. Few residents called for an emergency vote. Others wanted to go straight to the HOA's legal firm. But I had a better idea. I went to the police. I gave them a thumb drive with everything: videos, photos, the threatening note, the false accusations, and screenshots from neighbors who had received similar threats. And that's when it all came crashing down. After I handed over the footage and written testimonies from neighbors to the local police, I expected things to slow down. I figured they'd send some stern letters, maybe do a wellness check, or quietly warn Judith behind the scenes. What I didn't expect was what came next: a full-on investigation led by a special crimes officer and a visit from the city's district attorney's office within the week. Apparently, my complaint wasn't the only one that had landed on their desk. The officer I worked with, Detective Erin Lofgren, wasn't your average beat cop. She had a sharp tone and sharper eyes. When she sat down in my living room to review everything I'd compiled, she barely blinked. She just took notes, fast and furious, flipping between surveillance clips and neighbor screenshots. She paused and asked me, "Has Ms. Campbell ever tried to fine you for something that isn't technically an HOA violation?" "More than once," I replied. "She'll fine Lena for putting up a pride flag in the backyard last summer. That's not in any rules." Her eyes narrowed. She scribbled more. By the end of the conversation, she told me flatly, "This isn't just harassment. If the HOA is issuing fines not backed by their charter, and if she's using surveillance to manipulate or intimidate residents, we're looking at potential fraud, stalking, and maybe even civil rights violations." Those words hit me like a brick. I wasn't just a guy standing up to a nosy neighbor anymore. I was part of something much bigger. Over the next 2 weeks, Ridgeview Lakes changed dramatically. Police cruisers started patrolling more frequently, not to harass anyone, but to observe. Residents began filing formal complaints. The HOA's email inbox exploded with demand letters and refund requests. People who had stayed silent for months finally came forward, some with stories that made mine look tame. One woman named Dana, a nurse and single mom, showed me 4 separate violation letters Judith had sent her over the last year. For leaving her recycling bin out too long, even though she worked 12-hour night shifts and didn't return home until morning. Another was for excessive activity on her driveway, her 7-year-old. Drawing chalk butterflies. Judith had even sent a letter threatening to escalate Dana's fines if she didn't consider relocating to a more appropriate neighborhood. It was straight-up discrimination, and it wasn't just her. The more stories surfaced, the more patterns became clear. Judith had gone after single mothers, interracial couples, renters, and anyone she deemed unfitting for her suburban utopia. And she'd done it all under the protection of the HOAs. Named the dam finally burst on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Lena and I were home watching a movie when we saw the flash of red and blue through the living room blinds. 2 marked cruisers, 1 unmarked. 5 officers and 1 woman in a gray suit stepped out. They didn't come to our door. They went across the street, straight to Judith Campbell's house. I opened the blinds just enough to watch. One of the officers knocked. She answered still, wearing her robe as if she were above it all. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the look of smug annoyance fade from her face. She gestured wildly, pointed toward our house, then toward the street, and at her mailbox. The woman in the gray suit calmly responded, flashed her ID, then handed her something. A document. Judith screamed, not in fear, but in fury. She threw her mug across her porch. The ceramic shattered into pieces. The officers didn't flinch. They stepped in. And then right there in front of the neighborhood, they handcuffed her. Judith Campbell was arrested and placed into the back of a squad car while a dozen neighbors watched from porches and windows. The charges? Stalking, harassment, fraud, tampering with HOA records, false reporting, unlawful surveillance, and more. I couldn't believe it. The woman who once ruled our block with yellow envelopes and whispers was now sitting behind tinted windows with her hands behind her back, and that wasn't the end of it. The local news picked up the story within 24 hours. HOA president arrested for stalking and fraud in suburban surveillance scandal. It went viral. Every outlet, from local stations to national HOA watchdog blogs, covered it. Our little Ridgeview Lakes turned into the symbol of what happens when HOA power goes unchecked. More victims came forward, some who hadn't even lived in our neighborhood, but had previously served under Judith and other HOA boards. Turns out, this wasn't her first time on a power trip. It was just the first time someone fought back hard enough to take her down. The new interim board, led by Frank and a few other neighbors, announced a full audit of every fine issued over the past 5 years. They suspended all pending fines and promised reimbursement for anything Judith had issued outside proper rules. Even better, the HOA announced it was bringing in a neutral third-party law firm to rewrite the bylaws. Something like this could never happen again. They even added something called the Campbell Clause, which banned any board member from having unilateral power over violations, finances, or surveillance. It was poetic justice. A few days after the dust settled, Detective Lofgren came by my house. She brought a small box. Inside were photos Judith had taken, notes, copies of our front lawn from different angles. Even handwritten comments like "too many packages equals suspicious," and "their curtains are closed too often." It was disturbing, but it was also over. You helped stop something that could have gone a lot darker, the detective told me. She was obsessed. The pressure you put on this case brought it all to light. You have no idea how rare that is. Lena and I thanked her. Then I asked one last question. What happens to people like her? She shrugged. Depends. She'd likely be convicted of at least 1 felony, maybe more. But at minimum, she's lost everything that gave her power. That was enough for me. Weeks passed. Things got quiet again. No more bogus fines. No more creepy photos. No more power-hungry Karen lurking behind curtains and clipboards. Neighbors started talking like neighbors. Again, kids played outside without fear. Lena and I even hosted a little block party to celebrate. People brought cookies. Dogs played in yards. Jordan shot hoops in the driveway for hours, and as the sun set, I looked around and finally saw what I thought Ridgeview Lakes could be when we first moved in. K community. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. Judith didn't become a monster overnight. She always was one. The HOA just gave her the tools. But when enough people finally stood up, when the cameras pointed back at her, she couldn't hide anymore. She wanted control. But what she got was handcuffs. And in the end, the real authority wasn't in the HOA bylaws. It was in the truth.